Okay, thank you everybody for coming to this event. Bold Policies for Uncertain Times, organised with the Labour Tribune Group, in part to discuss one of their recent reports, The Change We Need, okay? So I'm Mirko Draca, I'm the director of the Cage Research Centre at the University of Warwick. As I said, co-organising this event with the Tribune Group. Let me next just introduce who's going to be speaking, so I'll just give you a rundown. So firstly, we'll have Byrne MP for Birmingham Hodge Hill since 2004, member of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, chair Global Parliamentary Network on the World Bank and the IMF, former Minister for Police and Counter-Terrorism, Minister for Borders and Immigration, served in Prime Minister Gordon Brown's cabinet as Minister for the Cabinet Office, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Chief Secretary of the Treasury. Most importantly, what I'd like to say about Liam is that he's an MP who's a pamphleteer. So these are a couple of his pamphlets, or well, he's edited this collection, The Change We Need, which is kind of a major basis of discussion tonight. Also another pamphlet, Reclaiming Freedom, the case for a 21st century of Bill of Powers and Duties, right? So something that's fallen out of fashion in politics to be a pamphleteer, and it's great to have Liam along. Then we'll have Clare McNeil. So Claire's an associate fellow at the IPPR, I'm sure you know what that acronym stands for, and is founder and chair of the London Progression Collaboration Initiative, which is breaking down barriers to good quality work for young, disadvantaged and marginalised people across the UK. Claire's a former associate director at the IPPR, where she led the organisation's work on social policy for 6 years, and is also senior research fellow for energy and climate change. She wrote influential reports on issues including the UK's working poverty crisis, the future of the welfare state, the care system in our ageing population, fixing our skills system, and achieving the transition to a low-carbon economy. Claire is also a former advisor to the Cabinet Office, where she led reforms to increasing levels of diversity and inclusion within the civil service, and has made numerous appearances discussing policy issues in the media. And we're really pleased to have Claire here, because as I said, we need to promote people in public discussion who are serious about rigorous policy discussion, right? Then next we'll have Andy Haldane. So Andy is Chief Executive Officer of the Royal Society of Arts. He was formerly Chief Economist at the Bank of England and a member of the bank's Monetary Policy Committee. Among other positions, he's an Honorary Professor at the Universities of Nottingham, Manchester and Exeter, Visiting Professor at King's College, a Visiting Fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford, Fellow of the Royal Society and Academy of the Social Sciences. He's founder and president of the charity Pro Bono Economics, vice chair of the charity National Numeracy, and chair of the National Numeracy Leadership Council. Finally, he was a permanent secretary for Levelling Up at the Cabinet Office from September 2021 and March 2022, and chairs the government's Levelling Up Advisory Council. So that's like what you can read on the internet about Andy. What I'd like to say about Andy is that, he's got this incredible kind of long history in policy, in particular at the Bank of England, and he is known by those of us kind of working within policy in the UK as someone who can get down in the trenches and who can sort of discuss policy in detail and is deeply intellectually engaged with rigorous policy discussion. And I think that's kind of evident in the respect he has, throughout the policy community and across different sides of politics. Finally, Arun Advani, Associate Professor at Warwick University, who I'm not going to read out a blurb about Arun. What I'll highlight about Arun as a fellow academic is, what does he do? Like, what's interesting about what Arun does as an academic from the perspective of myself as another academic is that, Arun is doing like cutting edge research on sort of public economics or public finance topics using sort of the latest administrative data, right? So what kind of Arun is doing is sort of digging into administrative tax records to do these cutting edge studies of all of these topics to do with tax audits, capital gains tax, the role of international migration, migrants in our tax system. And so he's doing that kind of cutting edge research, and he's also brilliant at making it matter and making the connections to make this stuff matter in terms of policy, bringing together legal experts, his collaborator Andy Summers, building a good network with civil service policymakers, politicians, and some of the best journalists in the country. Okay, and I kind of look forward to you guys kind of engaging with Arun's work. Okay, so without further delay, I'll hand it over to Liam.
Thank you so much. So greetings from the faraway land of Birmingham, where I'm a Member of Parliament. And I've been asked to speak for about 10 minutes just to set the scene. As you know, 10 minutes is about the average life of a Tory Chancellor, and I will try and finish on time. And really, we're here today, both myself and our great helmsman, Clive Efford, who is the chair of the Tribune group of MPs, in a spirit of real humility, not only because of the extraordinary range of minds and brain power that we've got on this panel, but because it was our privilege, really, to put together this extraordinary collection of essays. And both Clive and I have been around in politics for long enough to know that actually it's humility, not hubris, that you need in politics. When I first began my political career, I was working for Tony Blair. You got to know sometimes that hubris was pretty dangerous with Tony Blair. I think the high point for me, I don't know whether Clive has got a different story, but high point for me was Tony's address to the French National Assembly, which of course he chose to do in fluent French. And then feeling sort of rather full of himself, then decided to take all the questions and answers in French as well. And I think it really began to go downhill when I translate. But he basically confessed to what he wanted to say is that how much he admired Lionel Jospin in so many different ways. And of course, what came across is how much he desired Lionel Jospin in many different positions. So we got an early lesson in the importance of humility and not hubris in politics. So I'm going to hopefully click on these slides. I'm not quite sure where to point them, but Tom might need to step in and move the slides on, if that's okay, because the clicker doesn't need to work. Right, so here we go. It's beginning to work. That's let me just sort of click on one more. Do you want to just move them on? Here we go. Right. So who's the Tribune Group? So there is an old saying that politics is show business for ugly people. This picture disabuse you of that notion. This is a very beautiful, handsome, elegant group of about 70 members of Parliament. And I guess you would say that we're on the sort of soft left of the Labour Party. And we came together in the dark days of 2014, 2015. And I guess if I'm being honest, just sort of strictly between us in this room, it began as a bit of a self-help therapy group as we kind of met each week through some of the darker days of British political life. But it grew in force and it grew in strength, and it's now the biggest ginger group within the Parliamentary Labour Party. We have some quite famous alumni. One of them is called Keir Starmer, and he is now leader of the Labour Party. And Clive heroically chairs it each and every week. So in June last week, if we just move on, we decided that it was time for us to put together some thinking. Because if you listen to Keir, what he will often say frequently is that you've got to trust the process. And under his leadership, he had some issues to deal with, cleaning out anti-Semitism from the Labour Party, establishing our fiscal credibility. And now we're at the stage, a year and a half out before the next election, where we've actually got to show what is the kind of direction, what's the new course, what's the destiny that we see for the Labour Party. It's true in British politics that you can win by default. That is sort of true. Governments do tend to lose elections rather than oppositions winning them. But that isn't good enough for us. We came into politics because we want to change the world. And so what we need to do, because there is, nothing true in politics unless it's written down, we felt that we actually had to kind of put down some ideas to set out a direction of travel. And the pamphlet that I hope you can download and have a look through begins with our analysis of the state of the nation. Now, I'm old enough to remember when great officers of state only got fixed penalty notices of £100. This week, of course, we saw great officers of state getting tax penalty notices of well over £1 million. That is what, Andy? That's an 11,000% increase. So when you've got fine inflation of this kind of level being driven by the top of government, you can see why we've got such a problem with inflation. But the situation is even worse than that, because if you look at the figures now, you see that the UK is the only major economy that has not yet recovered its economic position from where we were before COVID. lowest growth, you'll forgive the Labour Party propaganda on the left-hand side of this slide, lowest growth in the G7. And the next slide really translates what that means into people and into living standards. So this is from a piece of work that's been put together by Torsten Bell and his team at the Resolution Foundation on Economy 2030. And it just shows you the plunge in living standards that we've seen. Now, for me, in Hodge Hill, in East Birmingham, I represent the most income-deprived constituency in our country. That literally means that I now have a member of staff who works on food banks. That literally means that a major part of my constituency operations now is making sure that our food banks don't run out of food. So Operation Compassion, something we launched a couple of years ago, is now in full force. We now have little kids helping collect us food, literally taking penguin bars out of their lunch boxes and putting them in food bank collection crates because we want to live in a community where nobody goes hungry. That's the reality of life now for millions and millions of the people that we serve. And it's going to get worse. So if you look at some of the work that Resolution Foundation are doing along with others now, if this continues, then by 2030, we may well have living standards per person that are actually worse than Poland. Now, that is in part because the great leadership of Poland is sort of ploughing the economy on, but actually that is where we are going to end up unless we begin to change course. We obviously may be an island, but we're also in a big wide world that is changing very, very quickly. And I guess when we looked out to the future and when we looked out around the world, we felt that perhaps 3 races are going to define the future of global politics. And our strategy, our national strategy, has to take account of that. So first, there's a science race. David Cameron used to talk about the global race. Well, if the global race is anything, it is a science race. If you look at the amount of money that is now being poured into science by both America and China, we now have more scientists alive than ever before, about 3 million scientists. They found a vaccine in the course of a year, for heaven's sake. But Britain's science base, disconnected from Horizon, disconnected from the United States, we risk falling behind in this great global race of the future. Second, there's obviously a new race for leadership on the world stage. What they talk about in Washington now and in Beijing is this great kind of decoupling after this great period of globalization that characterized my life after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We're now talking about how we decouple. Where does Britain fit in this great new divide in the world to come? We don't really know. But again, we risk falling behind and being left out. And then, of course, most importantly, there's a race against time as we try and beat climate change. So, we've got economic problems of our own, we've got living standard problems of our own, but we are also politicians in a world that is changing incredibly fast. So, on the next stage, we just wanted to sort of translate that into some of the challenges for us as a political movement. And we felt there's obviously a political challenge, an economic challenge, there's a distributional challenge, and there's a global challenge too. The next slide just sets out the political challenge because for all of the enthusiasm that there is for us as a party, we're a party that is full of energy, the task ahead of us is absolutely enormous. We need a swing that is bigger than the swing we enjoyed in 1997 just to get a majority of 1. That is an enormous challenge. And when you look at the way that coalitions in British politics have now fractured, they're far, far more complicated than they were before. And this is a dirty secret, and we don't talk about it very often, but in some ways we've become almost a gerontocracy. The biggest fact in British politics is that at the last election, we lost the over 65s by 3 million votes. 3 million votes. And yet, unless we can bring together new alliances between young and old, between haves, have-nots, and have-yots, between those who won't have in the future, unless we can bring together a coalition between those different groups, then we don't get to govern the country. So the political task now is much more complicated than it was in 97, the early 1960s, and in 1945. The next slide then is obviously just the big picture on the economics. Obviously, we've got to try and put an economy on a new course. We've got to try and set a course for net zero, but we've got to do that in a way that creates new jobs and indeed new industries. Crucially, we've got to tackle this problem of low productivity, and we've got to build a high-wage economy in which wealth is much more fairly shared. The next slide is distributional, and you've got some of the world's leading experts in distributional challenges on the panel. But the point I would make is this. Over most of Britain's post-war history, the wealth of the nation was about 3 times our annual GDP, broadly speaking. Wealth is now about 8 times GDP. What that means is that assets are more expensive and the earnings you enjoy in order to buy those assets are much lower. So if you're young, getting on a property ladder is incredibly difficult. And you can translate that into all kinds of challenges. If you think about the life cycle of students here, when you graduate, your earnings will be lower. You'll be paying an auto-enrollment pension because we're all living longer. You'll be paying off your student loan. And then somehow, you'll be expected to save up about £60,000 for a deposit on a house. It's just impossible. And so unless we can tackle some of these distributional challenges, we're not going to create a fairer or a stronger country. And then the final challenge, obviously global. I won't go through this at length because it's just so complicated. We could be here all night talking about it. There's a myriad of global challenges. And right now, frankly, Britain is not at the table. And, talking to Keir after he came back from Davos, that was the thing that really kind of struck him. You've got companies, diplomats, influencers from around the world who just don't see the UK now at the table. Our role as a global leader is frankly just getting lost. So we thought we would try and simplify the argument a little bit. And politics is an argument, politics is a discussion. And so for us, we felt that the argument that needed to be had kind of came down to these 3 dividing lines. So on the one hand, we need a different growth model. We've got to go for growth in a way that delivers climate security, and we've got to contrast that with what we would say is a conservative plan to carry on the same old magic beans, the same old incantations, that somehow if you cut tax, roll back the state, growth will somehow miraculously follow. And of course, we had the opportunity as a country to join in that great national experiment, otherwise known as Liz Truss, who actually tested this almost to destruction last year. So we think that that model, popularized in the 1960s and the 1970s, is pretty much dead. But we know that we've got to set out what the alternative looks like. Second, rather than defunding public services, we've got to build a country with active government, where we've got an active government that is providing the freedoms and the protections and building the ladders for the future that actually mean that we can be a country of social mobility once more. And we've got to contrast that to what we would say is our opponent's view, which is basically you're on your own. That is what individual liberty means in its extremis. It means that you're on your own and you've got to sink or swim. It's that world of dog eat dog and vice versa that they've pioneered over the last few years. And then finally, rather than divide and rule, rather than propagating these endless culture wars to try and divide one neighbour from the other, actually we would like to be the party that says we're stronger when we unite. And actually sometimes to take on big challenges in the future, unity is strength. We need to be a party of strong neighbourhoods rather than divide and rule. So that's broadly the kind of arguments that you see, that's broadly how we frame the arguments that you see in the pamphlet. So when it comes to green growth, what was very surprising is just the sheer number of ideas that came up from our authors. So Mariana Mazzucato talked about mission-orientated innovation policy, actually making decarbonisation a great national mission that you organise procurement around, trade around, investment, energy, manufacturing, corporate governance. Corporate governance in particular is something that's very important. Will Hutton's got a very good essay on this, but it's actually an argument that Andy has been making in what was a seminal essay many years ago. It was very influential on me about who owns the company. And so some of the contributions that we see in here on the next slide include, so Mariana, which I've talked about, but also Miata, who's talked about, has got a great essay in here about what the Green New Deal could look like, how you organise it, how you pay for it, how you translate that into good jobs. Jajic from National Institute for Economic and Social Researchers kind of couples that argument with an argument about fiscal policy and how fiscal policy needs to take aim at actually, things like well-being. As well as things like infrastructure, putting in different sorts of measures rather than simply trying to balance a budget over the medium term. There's a fantastic essay from Steve Turner, who is the head of manufacturing at Unite, based on actually on a lot of what you're doing here in Coventry. And I know this because Steve helped me write that bit of my manifesto when I ran for Metro Mayor here in the West Midlands a year or two ago. Will Hutton, brilliant essay on how we sort of change companies, how we put purpose at the heart of capitalism in new ways. And Claire, no doubt, will talk about her absolutely fabulous essay, which is about how we build a sort of a social investment story that sits alongside that investment story, and how we make sure that infrastructure investment isn't basically men in high-vis jackets and hard hats going around to sort of lay bits of concrete. It's also about things like social care and childcare and things that are critically important to the everyday economy. So, active government, 5 themes came through here in particular. Skills, something we talk about a lot, building homes, different kind of social security system that actually provides both security and social insurance, putting those 2 words back, incredibly important. Devolution, which Andy is obviously the expert in, and then tax, where I have to say, you know, Arun has pretty much written the book along with his colleagues, and this will be a big, big debate that we have over the course of this year. Michael Barnett's got good essays in, Will Snell's got good essays in, I won't go through those now, Torsten, and actually Gordon Brown as well. Paying for all of this is one of the biggest conversations that we need to have this year, and so, you know, I commend not just the essay, but also the work that Arun has done on this, because, you know, the real scandal from Nadeem Zawi is not the fact that the guy's just got fined £1.1 million for paying his taxes late. It's not what's illegal that's the scandal about the tax system, it's what's legal. You know, the fact that we live in a country where something like 57% of investment income goes to the top 10%, and that is taxed much lighter than regular income, is something that we should all be pretty horrified about. And we're not going to be able to build a different kind of country unless we fix some of these challenges. Strong communities, then, we think they mean safe communities. And on the next slide, we've just got a couple of examples. A brilliant essay from Jess Prendergast about how we build a different kind of more foundational economy, and obviously policing. Rick Muir is an expert in policing. He's written a brilliant essay about how we restore old ideas of neighbourhood policing. So that is a whistle-stop tour of what is in the book. And I suppose if I was to kind of wrap it up in a kind of a conceptual and sort of slightly more philosophical way, which is the subject of this other pamphlet, which has also come out from the Fabian Society, which is here. It's about actually how do you translate these big changes into what could be a different foundation for freedom for the 21st century. You think about the changes that lie ahead. You know, the changes in medical science could mean that we put another 10 years on life expectancy. If you think about another billion people going online, the kind of economy that could be created from this could be just extraordinary compared with what we have today. Something like $10 trillion worth of new wealth will be created by the 4th Industrial Revolution over the years to come. That is enough to give us a new foundation for freedom. But that could mean safety, it could mean work, it could mean decency, it could mean a right to nature, it could mean health, it could mean learning, it could mean respect, it could mean mobility, it could mean participation. Above all, it could mean hope. But we can deliver these new freedoms as new possibilities only if we stand together. We like to say in the Labour Party, we're the we party. The Tories, they're a me, me, me party. We're the we party. We're the party of us. But if we unite around some of these ideals, we truly believe that we can deliver in this century the freedom to be you. And that's something worth fighting for. Thanks so much.
Thanks. So when Liam asked me to write an essay for this collection, he asked me to write about the missing bits of our public services, our welfare system, and our social security system. And I was thinking about this last week because I had the privilege of visiting a town in North Wales called Blaenau Ffestiniog. It's a small former slate mining town, and I was there because I'm making a programme for Radio 4 about what we call the foundational economy. Now that's the everyday services that we all rely on, whether that's social care, childcare, education, retail, and even utilities. I was being shown around by a guy called Will, and he works for Cymru Bro. It's a network of social enterprises in the area. And they have either started up or bought, thanks to some seed funding from the Welsh Government, a number of the main shops and attractions in the local area. So he took me on a tour of the high street. He showed me the fish and chip shop, the hardware shop, the flat above the hardware shop, a mountain bike range, a hotel for people with disabilities. It's extraordinary, the array of local assets, really, that they had bought up, including the community pub, which was definitely a favourite. So it's a real success story. But as I was about to leave, he said, you know, people like you come here and you see the success, you see the entrepreneurialism, the activism, really, that this community is involved in. What you don't see is the hard work. You don't see that me and my team spend 2/3 of our time dealing not with that, but with elderly people who can't leave their homes because of moderate care needs, with people who need support with their benefits, advice on housing, on employment, setting up, as Liam was saying, food banks, baby banks, warm spaces. He told me about the people who are hauling sacks of coal upstairs to heat their homes, older people in the area who are dying in their homes because of the cold weather. Now, the work that they're doing is extraordinary, but it's not out of the ordinary. There are civil society organisations up and down the country who are doing the same and always will do. But I think what it really reinforced for me was that the minimums that we expect in this country, the ways in which we have agreed to share risk efficiently and humanely as a society, in too many places just aren't there, or they're not there adequately. So in the essay, I make 2 points really. Firstly, that we have a dangerously weakened welfare system. And secondly, the high levels of wealth inequality that we've just heard about from Liam. And I think the combination of these two against the backdrop of a weak economy, which is creating challenges for so many people up and down the country. So just firstly, on our weakened welfare system, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation put out their State of the Nation report. It's an annual report. They published it today. And one of the facts in there was that we are approaching a 35-year low in the basic rate of social security. A 35-year low. It's extraordinary. So when I'm thinking about what's missing from our welfare system, yes, it's the things that we need to thrive and prosper, a decent skills system, lifelong learning so that we can adapt in a changing world of work, childcare, affordable childcare, accessible childcare so that we can go out and contribute to the economy. All of these things are essential, but it's a living income if you are low paid to be able to clothe your children and keep warm. That is really essential to fund your living costs if you are disabled, or to support with moderate care needs if you're elderly. Without these basic minimums, it's very hard to progress. So that's the first thing that we have to recognise, that providing these minimums is essential both as a civilised society, but also for a productive workforce and economy. Now, to some extent, this was true the last time that Labour was riding high in the polls in 1997. But what's different, and is why we need to be thinking even more boldly than in 1997, is these toxic levels of inequality that I'm sure we'll hear more about. So, again, for example, in Blanau, I saw how locals there are trying to buy up, housing in the community because the costs are just unaffordable for people that want to stay there, to live there. Costs are being driven up by Airbnb short-term lets. So they're really fighting an uphill battle, and our unregulated private rented sector is projected to keep expanding well into the next decade. And social security payments just aren't keeping up. So de facto, we will have more people moving into poverty because we just don't have the systems that are there to help deal with the unaffordable cost of housing, and we're not regulating the sector at the moment. So that's just one example of how our increasingly asset-based economy is producing inequalities of wealth and power, which have actually become embedded in our welfare system. So in terms of these missing bits of our welfare system, what do some of the bold policies that we need for reform look like? So in the essay, I set out 3 areas for reform. Firstly, ensuring the provision of the social minimums that I talked about. So whether that's a living income based on a higher basic rate of universal credit, or whether that's a lower taper rate to help people who are low paid keep more of their earnings as they move into work. Secondly, a bold social investment agenda. We won't see either the increases in productivity that we need or improvements in our health and quality of life if we don't invest in our public services to to collectivise risk and really share opportunity through our welfare system. So that's investments in childcare, skills, social care would be priorities in my view, and undoubtedly facilitated by some of the reforms to wealth taxation that we'll hear about from Arun. Thirdly, confronting the inequalities in power and ownership that are perpetuating poverty and injustice in society. So in the essay, I talk about how we can curb the unregulated expansion of our private rented sector, partly by stimulating alternatives to it, so sort of trying to contain it and shrink it, community not-for-profit alternatives. Yes, we need to build homes, but it will take, potentially up to a decade to see impacts for people who are living in the private rented sector right now. So there is an imperative to do more in the short term. Similarly, we need to invest in social care and childcare, yes, but we also need to curtail the debt-fueled expansion of the private sector in those sectors, which is risking the sustainability of childcare and social care. So finally, underpinning all of this is what I'm really pleased to see Labour bill as the kind of biggest transfer of power from central government to local government and communities that we have ever seen. Because without that transfer of power and empowering people in communities like Blenheim, I don't think any of this will really happen. So it's not just bold policies that we need, but bold politics.
Okay, Andy, would you like to speak?
Evening, everyone. Lovely to see you all, and great to be on this great panel. I thought I'd talk a little bit about economic growth, because we haven't got any, and about a strategy for economic growth, because we haven't got one. And those two things are not unrelated. I do that, conscious that growth, of course, isn't everything. It may not even be the most important thing. But when you haven't got it, it does make life a bit trickier. It's growth that pays for pay rises, the like of which we haven't had for the average person for 15 years and counting. And it's growth that pays for public services, which actually have been in retreat over that period. So it matters, even though it's not the only thing that matters. So let me focus my comments on that. Actually, my diagnosis of why we haven't had growth is alarmingly simple. I think we have a deeply ruptured supply side of our economy. It's not about demand. We've sought to get growth up through the pump priming of demand when that is the wrong diagnosis. That's among the reasons why government debt sits at £2.5 trillion. Fully £1 trillion worth of which sits on the balance sheet of my former employers at the Bank of England. So the conventional tools of monetary and certainly the tax adjusting parts of fiscal policy have not done the job. And that's because they act on the demand side of the economy, and the problems largely reside on the supply side of the economy. So in fixing the supply side, what might be done? Well, regrettably, there's all sorts of parts of the supply side that aren't functioning well. And by the way, it's those supply side fractures and frictions and fissures that lie at the root of why we have a cost of living crisis, and probably will have a cost of living crisis for some little while to come. When you look to solutions, as I say, given my time is short, I'll only focus on one aspect of this, but completely conscious that many aspects of the so-called supply side do not function as we would wish and need very radical reform. That would include, and Liam touched upon this, the level at which we make decisions in this country. The best laid national economic plan is, to my mind, best executed at the local level. It's built from the bottom up. That's why agency is greatest. That's where information is greatest. That's therefore where power should reside. And therefore we do need a Devo plan, certainly Devo Max, that is at least as ambitious as that laid out by Gordon Brown in his report to Keir Starmer towards the end of last year, at least as ambitious as that. We do need to think about fueling our innovation engine. Of course we do. We need to spend at least as much attention, though, in ensuring the engine for diffusing that innovation to companies is functioning. And currently, UK PLC has a pretty well-functioning innovation engine and a badly misfiring diffusion engine. That's among the reasons, among the most important reasons, why we have a productivity problem in this country. And finally, when it comes to infrastructure, also super important. But it's important also that we invest in the plurality of infrastructure. Not just the stuff that's on the media all the time, as important as that is, physical infrastructure, like roads and rail, but also digital infrastructure, clearly. But last and not least, and Claire touched upon this, social infrastructure. The things that make life worth living, the things that make places, decent high streets, youth clubs, green spaces, football clubs, and the like. Often the poor relation of the infrastructure debate, but for most people, among the most important dimension. They're all really important, as are other stuff. The issue I do want to talk about, though, in a bit more detail, is actually education and skills. So, economics, or economic growth, is really easy to understand. So basically, either grow the number of people who are working, or you make those people slightly more productive, right? That's how you grow the supply side of your economy. It really is that simple. We're doing pretty badly on both fronts because our workforce isn't expanding, it's been contracting over the past couple of years, partly, largely perhaps, as a result of COVID with a bit of Brexit thrown in. So we've lost between 500,000 and 1 million people from the workforce for those reasons after a long period when we had a growing workforce, which was the only reason our economy has grown over the period since the global financial crisis. On the other bit, the second cylinder, productivity, that has been flatlining for about 15 years and counting, give or take. So the first cylinder is now shrinking and the second cylinder has been stalling. Where is growth, therefore, to come from? Well, it's clear that if we are to grow the productivity side of that equation, we need to invest and do a better job when it comes to nurturing our education system and when it comes to nurturing skills. We have perhaps as many as 15 million people in the workforce who do not have the skills they need to do their job well. Of course, that's tripping up their capacity to be productive in the workforce. When it comes to education, we know loads now about how deep-seated educational inequalities are seeded in the earliest of years, and that seed grows and grows and grows through the lifespan and shows up ultimately in inequalities in both opportunity and in income. Those most in need of lifelong learning are those that least likely to access lifelong learning. And that won't wash. Our educational model, our education skills model, which has served us pretty well actually for the last 150 years or so, is no longer fit for purpose in the 21st century. This is the bold bit of the bold policies in the title of this evening. What was that model? That was a model that essentially built academic skills in young people in big blocks using a method that was sort of chalk and talk, principally, backed up by examinations, and delivered by teachers in schools. That was the what and the how and the where of our educational model. And it did a good job. But it won't do a good job and isn't doing a good job if we stick with that course now. Both the what and the how and the where needs to change fundamentally if we are to repair the deficits in education and skills that are already only too clear. So on the what, of course, it no longer washes to think of only educating people when they are young. In the land of 100-year lives and perhaps 70 or 80-year careers, of course learning needs to be lifelong, and we are a world away of having institutions fit for purpose in delivering that. And when it comes to the what sets of skills? I mean, while we're thinking about that, my only cultural reference point these days, by the way, is Bake Off. So just think cakes for a second. The base layer of the skills and learning cake is the foundational skills without which none of us, whatever we do in life, will thrive. This is the literacy, the numeracy, increasingly digital literacy. We do pretty poorly on that as a nation overall. We could and should do much better. Then the middle layer, that's the jam and the cream. That's the academic and the vocational skills, the non-transferable skills, so-called. And on that, we do pretty well on the academic bit. That's half of young people going to university, and really poorly on the cream. That's the vocational bit. That needs to toggle as well. But as important is the top layer of the cake, which is largely absent right now. And those aren't so much the skills that are non-transferable, but rather the capabilities that are transferable and we know will be even more important in the future world of work. Things like creativity and innovation and empathy and interpersonal skills and negotiation and communication. Those things we'd all agree are really important, but aren't actively recognized and rewarded in our current educational system. That's a means by which it needs to change, looking ahead from now, so that the learning process isn't examination-based, it's more experiential and team-based in its orientation. We have not ever previously in human history been able to deliver genuinely personalized learning. We've been constrained by the supply of schools and the supply of teachers. Technology now means we are freed from those constraints. We know that people have fundamentally different learning styles. That chalk and talk and examination approach served pretty well the learning style of certainly everyone in this room. That's why we're in this room. But does not serve well the learning style of a great many other people. And that's why they leave school with the worst possible endowment, which is hating learning rather than loving learning. That's why they do so little of it when they leave school. There is no reason now why we cannot adapt the learning journey of every person to their own personalized learning style and indeed to their own circumstances. Because although I'm the same person at one level as what I was when I was 15, the way in which I'd learn is fundamentally different. This is not just adapting the learning journey to your neurology, but also to your circumstances, making it much less likely that anyone steps off the education and learning bus, which is crucial in a world of lifelong learning. And through digital and AI, there's no reason these days why that journey, that learning journey, that lifelong learning journey cannot be attuned to each and every one of our circumstances and neurologies. In the same way as medicine is becoming personalized, so too should be education. That's big, that's bold, that's very different from where we've been, but in terms of closing those gaps in educational opportunity and attainment, and therefore in income, and ultimately in growth, big and bold is what's needed. Let me stop there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. So for me, it's fantastic to be speaking at the end of this, as the last member of this panel. Liam gave us a whole kind of plethora of great ideas of things we should be thinking about. Claire picked up into more detail some of those really important issues around investment, around social welfare and social support, among other things. Andy's just told us how we need to spend more on education to try to do a better job there, as well as thinking out that devolution piece and thinking out how we can raise funding at the local level. All of those questions, all those steps are fantastic, but the natural question for any government is, okay, so how are you going to pay for those? And so, that's where it falls to me to try to get you excited for 5 minutes about tax and explain to you, although it's not the thing you most came here to hear, that actually there are options out there are opportunities out there for us to, one, fund all of those things, two, to do that in actually a fair kind of way, and three, to actually do things that fix current problems in the tax system, some of which will be actively good for growth. So often the idea of raising taxes is sort of, it's painted as the worst thing you could do for growth, and you're saying, well, there's a trade-off, maybe we'll accept it, even though it's going to have these negative impacts. But actually the tax system right now is so broken that there are many things you can do that raise taxes and are actually improving growth at the same time. So let me start by just telling you where the standard debate on tax is. When there's this discussion of how are you going to raise money, the thing you'll hear people say who are experts in tax is there are only three taxes that matter in this country. There's income tax, there's national insurance, which is like income tax but only paid by people who work, and VAT, the tax on stuff you buy. And those are the three taxes which genuinely are the biggest taxes in this country. They bring in a huge share of all tax revenue the government gets. And so the answer is, well, the only thing you can do is to raise money from those. And the mistake in that thinking is it's absolutely true that those are the three biggest taxes. No one should try to convince you you can abolish any of those taxes and somehow fund the tax system without an income tax or fund it without a VAT. That's just not going to work. That's not where we can be. Those taxes are crucial. But starting from where we are, if we're thinking about how do you raise £10 billion, 20 billion, £50 billion, which is a lot of money, those are actually numbers that you can credibly raise without having to touch those standard taxes. Because the current tax system, in terms of the way it taxes wealth, is fundamentally broken. We already heard actually about the fact that wealth has become much more important as a share of GDP. That means that the total value of stuff that people own is worth much more than the value of stuff that's being produced each year. Those assets that are out there are now more valuable relative to what the incomes are. And that's part of this big puzzle, or part of this big difficulty for the intergenerational question, where assets are typically held by older households, and young people typically won't have that much in assets. They will be trying to work to try to get those assets, but their incomes are not going to be that high compared to what they earn. And so, fundamentally, there ends up being a divide for young people, not really about the intergenerational, but about, for someone who's young, do you come from a family where eventually at some point you're going to be handed those assets? Or do you come from a family where you won't be? Because so much more of the lifetime resources you have will depend on the assets that you are able to be given by your grandparents, parents, aunts and uncles, whoever it may be. So that's become one of the really kind of fundamental questions, actually for social mobility in this country. And that again is one of the things that's a block on growth. So how can we fix this? What are the challenges out there we could actually go and immediately do and try to fix? You could fix capital gains tax. That's the tax that's been in the news because of the former Chancellor, now Chair of the Conservative Party, who didn't pay all of the capital gains tax that was due. And as Liam pointed out, the scandal at the moment that's being focused on is the fact that he had to pay this fine for not having paid the £3.7 million that he carelessly didn't remember to pay. But the scandal should be the fact that all he owed on £27 million of capital gains was £3.7 million in tax. Now you often have in your mind, the top rate of income tax is 45%, so it's like almost a half. So you take 27 million, you go almost a half, well that's going to be something you'd expect, something above £10 million, it's going to be a big number. The amount that HMRC said he should have been paying was £3.7 million. That tells you almost everything you need to know about the way in which we tax capital in this country. Capital is taxed at much lower rates. So capital gains in particular have the most preferential rate. There's a tax rate out there that's as low as 10% on the first £1 million of capital gains. Until a couple of years ago, it was actually 10% on the first £10 million. And there was actually a brilliant speech by Rishi Sunak as Chancellor in which he said why this was the worst tax break in the country, why it failed to create growth, why it was creating inequality, all of these problems. But then he decided just to cut it from 10 million to £1 million because £1 million at 10%, that's kind of fine. And that seemed like a bit of an odd move rather than scrapping the thing. But that's what we have at the moment. And even once you get beyond that first £1 million, if you have that much money that you're going beyond that, the tax rate then on capital gains is 20%. So the straightforward thing to propose, and again, this is an extreme socialist idea because it was done by Nigel Lawson in 1988. But this extreme social idea would be just to tax capital gains at the same rate as income tax. Does that seem reasonable? You get money, whether it comes from capital gains or it comes from income, you could tax it at the same rate. Of course, there are things to do alongside that. So you want to have an allowance that accounts for inflation. You don't want to tax people just on the fact the value of the stuff went up just because there was inflation. You also want to smooth things out. If I have a capital gain of £100,000, I own something and it went up £100,000 in value, but it did that over 20 years, it seems a bit unreasonable to put me in the top tax bracket when that's actually only a gain of £5,000 per year. Maybe I shouldn't be in the top tax bracket, or even the 40% bracket. So there are things you can do to smooth those things out. But fundamentally, there are things like taxing capital gains like income. Another area that's important and makes some people very annoyed is inheritance tax. Inheritance tax is often very unpopular. It's the most hated tax in the country. But one of the reasons it's so hated is because it's so broken. It's a high tax rate. It's 40% once you get, in practice, for a couple who own a property, who are married, it's after about the first £1 million you end up starting to pay that tax rate. But the thing that's really striking about it is that the average tax rate, so you obviously pay nothing on that first bit, then you start paying tax on the bit above that. And so the average tax rate goes up and up, and that's what you'd expect in a tax that's progressive. It goes up and up until it hits a peak at £2 million. And then this graph from actually the Office for Tax Simplification, the government body, showed that it then flattens out and then it drops. So that if you're at £10 million, you're paying only an average rate of 10%. And that's because once you get to those levels of wealth, it's now worthwhile to pay somebody who's expensive to sit and think about how can they best structure your wealth so that you're going to minimize that tax that you pay. Again, there are a bunch of detailed things. I'm not going to go through every detail of the fixes, but there are some simple fixes like getting rid of the fact that someone like James Dyson can buy up chunks of the countryside, and because it's agricultural land, he can pass the agricultural land on tax-free. It's not because he wants to go and be a farmer that he's buying this stuff up, it's because he knows he can pass that on tax-free. And that just doesn't make any sense. It's not good for the system, but it's also not even good for farmers, because there are farmers who will now tell you, look, I can't afford to, I'm a productive farmer, I want to expand my land. I can't afford to expand my farm, because I'm competing with somebody who doesn't want to farm the land, who wants to buy the land, rent it to someone like me, but in the meantime they want to own it just because they can pass it on tax-free. So it's not good for the farmers either. There's the same problem with business property relief. But then the final thing to say is, even if we fix those existing taxes on wealth, and there's lots of things we can do to fix those existing taxes, there is then that puzzle at the end of, if you do all of those things, is that enough? And if you think that wealth inequality is important, if you think that it's a problem that there's been this growth in the concentration of wealth at the very top end, then fixing all of those existing taxes on wealth will not be enough to reduce that concentration of wealth. If you think that that is important, and it's not for me as an academic to tell you inequality is important or isn't important, although it's worth saying that wealth inequality contributes to a decline in social mobility, which is in itself bad for growth. But if you think that rise in wealth concentration is a problem, the only option you have out there for you is an annual wealth tax. It's a tax that's on the stock of wealth on a regular amount, so that every year you take the value of somebody's wealth. If it's above some threshold, the bit above that threshold you tax. And when we ran the Wealth Tax Commission to look at this, we recommended you don't have an annual wealth tax starting at a low threshold like Switzerland or Norway. Those countries don't have either a capital gains tax or an inheritance tax. We have those. We don't need to tax most people through an annual wealth tax. But if you care about wealth inequality, you do need an annual wealth tax. It should start at a high threshold, something like £10 million. That will cover about 22,000 people in the country. So it's a very small share of the population. But actually, a tax of something like 1% on the value above that £10 million. So someone who's at £10 million and £1 is paying 1p, and you're paying only like 1% on every pound above that threshold. That tax of 1% above £10 million raises now about £11 billion, which is roughly the same as putting 2 pence on the basic rate of income tax. So you're either taking the entire population of people who are working and saying we're taking your tax rate up by 2%, taking you from 20 pence for every pound you earn to 22 pence, or you're putting a 1% tax just on the people who have wealth above £10 million, only on the bit that's above £10 million, and that is enough to raise almost the same amount of money. And so that's the final piece that I would kind of suggest towards paying for these kind of great ideas that we've seen on this panel. Thanks.
My name is Eleanor. I'm a undergraduate student at the University of Warwick, and my question was directed at Claire. So essentially, you talked a little bit about how we want to appeal to people's like sort of social infrastructures, and I'm based in London. I do a lot of research about young people and their kind of stakes in society. And recently, I did a meeting with Partnership for Young London, who did some research very recently on like what young people prioritize in their young lives. And essentially, you touched on, for example, the increase in youth club provision and stuff like that as a source of stability for young people. But actually, according to the research, youth clubs actually fell quite low on the list. And therefore, instead of turning to sort of qualitative measures such as youth clubs and provisions, young people are actually wanting more sort of qualitative provisions, such as like mental health support or like safety in the streets and stuff like that. So how do we sort of implement those policies which aren't as hardline, yeah, we can allocate this building or these things, but more about the mentality of young people, especially when we're trying to, in like a political context, when we're trying to get young people to vote for certain parties and stuff like that. How do we sort of implement policies which address those issues rather than ones that we think young people want, when really the research shows that they don't?
Thanks for the question. Fantastic question. I mean, I think, you know, it's the point about the gerontocracy, really, that we're living in, that we don't hear these voices often enough, and we don't hear about what young people's priorities are in politics, even when it comes to the massive issues like housing. So, I mean, on that point, you know, absolutely, mental health support I would include in the sort of set of minimums that we need to be thinking about providing as a society, and, you know, top of the list of priorities for any sort of social investment spending. And I mean, absolutely, safety, you know, crime, policing, these are all issues that don't just concern adults and older people. Increasingly younger people, young women especially, have these concerns. So I think, you know, we need to listen to the voices of communities. We need to put more power in the hands of communities and help them to allow them to make decisions. So I'm really for the sorts of deliberative democracy forums, you know, that allow people to participate at a kind of community level, make decisions about where spending goes. So, you know, that's the kind of thing I would like to see more of.
Hi, Michael Orton, Institute for Employment Research at the University of Warwick. Did anybody say welcome to Coventry, to those who've made the effort to come here today? Couple of observations and a question. On a reflection, it's the word bold, I think, is troubling me a bit. So, like, skills, really important, but would bold actually mean looking holistically at the labour market, so as we're looking at both supply and demand and all the issues about the many rubbish jobs that are out there as well, and employers' lack of investment in training and so on. Similarly with Claire's great work on minimums, that's really important, but would bold be doing something a bit more, having decent income? And rather than childcare being affordable, how about childcare that is part of the universal provision of free services? And then sort of on that same theme, I think it's where there's so many plans out there already, and that's where Arun's work is brilliant, because he's doing the stuff that we all need, and it's there. We don't need to spend months and months debating stuff. People like him are actually doing it. So that comes to my question, which is, everything that's been talked about is great, but what maybe is needed is, if we remember the 80s, Thatcher's 2 or 3 headline policies that meant you knew where you stood. The right to buy, selling off of utilities, anti-union legislation. Biden in the States at the moment with social security, infrastructure, green investment. I'd say to each panel member, what are your 2, 3 headline policies that are bold, that will actually tell the world what a Starmer government, or your idea of a Starmer government, will be doing? Thank you.
So I think the lesson from the 80s is that you've got to have a strategy, as Andy said, to put your economy on a different course. But you've also got to have a strategy for individual wealth. And, you know, the idea of a property-owning democracy is not the exclusive preserve of the right. It's actually something that has been talked about on the left, from economists like James Mead through to John Rawls, and we've kind of lost sight of it. And so I think we've got to do a couple of things. I think there's an infrastructure question, and that isn't just digital infrastructure and high-speed too. It is childcare. Universal childcare is probably the single most important policy that I think Labour should be campaigning for at the next election. Because it just does so many good things all round. But you've got to put alongside this story about investment in infrastructure, and obviously a lot of that's got to be green. You've got to put together a story about wealth as well. And, you know, I call it universal basic capital. So how do we make sure, for example, that all of us have got an auto-enrollment pension account now, right? So why don't you put alongside that national savings accounts too? Why don't we do what other countries have done and create things like sovereign wealth funds? The IPPR called it the Commonwealth Fund, that puts together assets that are big enough to yield a dividend of £10,000 to every young person at the age of 25, so that they've got a down payment either for additional skills or additional or for a house or something. And then the final piece of the puzzle for me is that you have got to change the way companies work in this country in two ways. So, you know, I've referred to an essay, a lecture he gave some years ago about who owns the company. Actually putting people in the boardroom who have genuinely got a long-term interest in the company, like workers or creditors or suppliers or customers, begins to sort of put our companies on a longer-term time horizon. But, you know, the thing that we've not really looked at hard enough is how we empower pension savers. So the fact that you've now got auto-enrollment means that it won't be long before there's £500 billion worth of new pension savings that belong to us. But right now, it's almost impossible for you to invest in companies that aren't dodging their taxes, screwing their workers, or poisoning the planet. So we've actually got to come up with some simple changes that empower us as pension savers to say, do you know what, I'm not going to invest in companies like that. I'm going to invest in companies that are doing good things as well as turning a return. So I just think that unless we can couple together a story about green growth with a story about a wealth-owning democracy and a democracy of wealth-owning, we won't really harvest the political capital that we need at the next election. And I think, you know, both of those things are actually within reach.
So hello, hi. I have a question for Liam, please. So you spoke about trying to make sure the UK becomes a global player again. How do you suggest it should be done?
So this is definitely not the party line, and I have the freedom to do this as a humble backbencher. You know, we have to fix our relationship with Europe. You know, I'm one of those people who thought Brexit was a disaster, and I see that damage that is now done to our trade relationship, our education relationships, our science base, you know, our security system on so many different levels. You know, we have gone backwards. So the first thing we've got to do is to try and fix that relationship up. The second thing that we've got to do is actually start getting active in some of the multilateral institutions that we created back in 1944. So, you know, Franklin Roosevelt welcomed the world to Bretton Woods in 1944 with the words that the economic interest of everyone is of legitimate concern to everyone. And, you know, right now, because we've cut our aid budget so savagely, we're no longer able to be the big players that we once were in the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. You know, there is no power on earth like those Bretton Woods institutions that are able to quarterback development assistance in countries around the world. And, you know, if we don't want China to become the lender of last resort to the global south, then we just need to carry on doing what we're doing right now. But actually, if we want to change the course of the future for many of these countries, then we need to, you know, just start reinvesting in these great international institutions that we created years ago. And it was a real backward step when Liz Truss decided to pull back from a lot of these organisations and say everything's got to have a Union Jack on it, and we're not investing in it unless it's got a Union Jack on it. And it was the worst kind of nativism. And actually, if global Britain means anything, it means a country that's comfortable in the world and works together with other countries in the world. And that mindset is something that we desperately need now.
My name's Tim Brown. I've lived in Coventry for 50 years, and I'm also chair of a large housing association in the East Midlands. And I've spent about 6 hours today on an away day for our housing association. And what worries me is, because I've been inspired by the contributions this evening, particularly from Clare, is a lot of organisations at the local level are just having to be reactive to so much that's going on. We spent a good hour today discussing how we could support our food banks, how we could sort of maximise the income coming to our tenants. But we recognise we've got to have a bigger debate, like the debates this evening. And it really worries me that we haven't got the space, the resources, the time at local level for local organisations to actually think through these issues. Because I think there's got to be a lot of bottom-up thinking and bottom-up action to do it. But it's how do we create the time to do it? And I'd be really interested from Clare and Andy how organisations such as Housing Association, and we're a large association, 20,000 properties across 40 local authorities, but we struggle with the time. We're always being reactive to crises all the time and not taking a strategic long-term perspective.
So, I mean, I think a lot of what you're talking about is hidden, actually. I think we know about the economic situation that Labour, if it's successful at the next election, will inherit, but we don't hear as much about the social challenges. And there will be a period of time for organisations like yours to kind of, rebuild. I think that will be necessary. I don't have answers to your very big and difficult question, but I think it's really important to recognise the huge, huge challenges that many organisations are having to deal with because the welfare state has retrenched, it's stepped back.
I think the problem you outlined, which is, where is the cognitive bandwidth to think about tomorrow when you're dealing with today? And what is true of business is as true of households, is as true of local government. I mean, at least part of the issue here is, of course, that we've seen a leaching of powers and monies at the local level. And that has reduced the capacity and the capability of local leaders. I don't just mean local government leaders, I mean local business leaders, local community leaders, to act, to develop their own strategy for their local place, and then having designed it to deliver on that strategy. So I do think, for me, this is among the strongest cases for a fulsome and full-scale decentralisation and devolution of powers from the Whitehall machine to the local level. And I don't just mean from central government to local government. I mean to local leaders, plural, whether in civil society or in business or in local government. The best examples I see right now around the UK of areas forging ahead is when they have crafted their own local strategy and have then set about delivering that strategy by a partnership relationship that straddles state, local government, local business, local institutions, including universities and colleges, and local members of civil society. That's always, by the way, been the magic recipe since the Industrial Revolution, and is no less the case now. So for me, I don't have a full answer to your question, but I think part of it at least is the empowering and enabling of local actors to be masters of their own destiny, public, private, and third.
Yeah, hi. My question is directed towards Claire. You were just hinting at that issue of welfare state retrenchment, but one benefit that hasn't really experienced that is state pension, which is protected by the triple lock. So, I mean, with state pension, on one hand, you have this issue of perhaps intergenerational inequality, the fact that perhaps if we keep like pension replacement rates at the level they are right now, that will require like an increasing tax burden, which will disproportionately hamper like working age people. But on the other hand, if you cut back pensions, that runs the risk of like aggravating elderly poverty. So there's like obviously a trade-off here. I mean, how do you think we ought to get around those trade-offs?
So, I mean, these are political questions to a large extent. I mean, I think that we should seek to maintain levels of spending on pension that we have. We've had a big success story in terms of alleviating pensioner poverty, and it's actually not true that across the board, I mean, there's a growing number of people in their 50s and 60s who are receiving the state pension who are in poverty. So it's not like we've solved pensioner poverty. I think we do, though, need to look at the balance of spending. You know, child poverty was something that we heard a lot about at the start of Keir Starmer's leadership. We're hearing, I mean, I think sort of less about it now as one of the key issues, and it is disgraceful the extent to which working families and children have borne the brunt of the cuts under austerity and today. So I think it comes back to the point about intergenerational fairness. There is a big question about how we ensure that we hold these things in balance, and that we're not swayed by the largest voting group, which is obviously pensioners.
So I'm James Varney from the University of Warwick's Labour Society. I'd just like to ask the panel, we've heard about bold policies for an uncertain future, and one policy that has been touted and was almost hinted at actually by Liam was a universal basic income. We've heard about sort of the 10 grand for young people, but maybe applying that universally, would that solve an uncertain future? Or does it not really address the sort of more structural problems that face our society today?
So I think there's two things for me on this. So we do have a universal basic income in Britain, and it's called a pension. And it's quite expensive, and that's why the government is now making noises about putting up the retirement age. For a community like the community I serve, that's a disaster. In Allen Rock, people live 8 years less than they live in Sutton Coldfield. And, Michael Marmot's essay in this book actually explains how that life expectancy is going down at the moment. So there's a universal basic income that we've actually got to kind of protect and enhance while balancing with how we transfer wealth to the next generation. And I think there's a couple of models of universal basic income that actually the RSA and others have talked about. I think it's pretty difficult to deliver, because delivering a universal basic income to every citizen is just phenomenally expensive. But you could begin developing sovereign wealth funds that could yield a one-off capital payment to young people that help them get that flying start in life, and giving young people the choice as to whether to put that towards learning or putting it towards a home, or indeed just putting it towards savings and a pension of their own. It's about transferring that power to young people in a way that we're just not doing at the moment. Gen Z is going to become the most unequal generation in history if we're not careful, because as the baby boomers start to leave us, we're going to see the biggest intergenerational transfer of wealth that perhaps we've ever seen. But the problem is not all heirs are equal. Some will inherit a lot. 25% of the over 65s have a net wealth of £1 million. Now, if you're lucky enough to be in that family, maybe your inheritance will be okay. But lots of other people will just inherit debts and care costs. And so if we don't want this great multiplier of wealth inequality to happen, then we have got to start thinking more radically about changes that transfer wealth to young people. So the model of universal basic income that I find most attractive has been called it's almost like a universal dividend, but it's a dividend that comes from a wealth fund that is designed to make a big impact for young people, which is a one-off payment. And so for those who haven't seen the IPPR report on Commonwealth funds, I'd kind of commend it. And again, this is becoming a cross-party issue now. So John Penrose, who's a Tory MP, has written about the virtues of sovereign wealth funds, different objectives, but you're beginning to see what is something that we've never really considered in this country. is now becoming, something that is talked about a lot.
So finally, would you like to join me in a clap to thank the panelists and everyone else?